Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by our friends at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is a fantastic organisation. It does a lot of things to help animal studies scholars. Among those things is it organises a conference every 2 years. Now, the next conference will be held in New Zealand, coming up in 2019. And as you're listening to this episode of Knowing Animals, the call for papers is currently open. So if you'd like to join us in New Zealand in 2019 at the Australasian Animal Studies Association Conference, now's the time to submit your abstract. Right, well, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from lovely Sydney town. I've left all the windows open so you'll be able to hear the aeroplanes in the background. That's nice, that's creating ambience. But the reason I've got the windows open is that it is a glorious sunny day in Sydney, probably a picture perfect day, not a cloud in the sky, the sun's shining and it's not too hot. Now, I'm stalling a little bit because it's absolutely certain that I'm going to mispronounce the name of my next guest. But all listeners of Knowing Animals know that I'm unable to read, write and speak properly, so you're going to forgive me. So in this episode of Knowing Animals, I'm lucky to be joined by Elisa Aaltola. Can you say that?
That went well, Siobhan.
Oh, it wasn't too bad. Elisa is a philosopher at the University of East Finland. Today we're going to discuss her new book, Varieties of Empathy, Moral Psychology and Animal Ethics, which was published by Rowman and Littlefield. So welcome to the podcast, Elisa.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. It's great to be here.
So could you start by telling us why you wrote this book?
I wrote it because my history is in analytic animal philosophy, and I used to be very rationalistic in the sense that I tried to do a lot of reasoned analysis and logical argumentation on behalf of non-human animals. And as I was doing that, I more and more started to miss the effective dimension of human moral agency and started to get puzzled over why moral arguments weren't enough, why reasoned argumentation didn't suffice to render the whole world vegan. We have all the arguments, but still most people are eating animal products and not taking other animals seriously. So I started to venture into the arena of emotions, and empathy was the most obvious first point of entry, and hence writing the book on empathy and varieties, different types of empathy.
So you're a bit down on rationality. Can you start by telling us why you think rationality is problematic?
Well, I don't think that rationality as such is problematic, but I think it's been over-prioritized in Western thinking. Particularly in analytic philosophy, the role of reason has been highly underscored. The notion that we have is that all that we really need is reasoned analysis. And clearly on an empirical level, that's not the case. Empirically, people are not so reason-orientated. We are more led by emotions and different affects and social beliefs and cultural dogma. So reasoned argumentation and logics just does not suffice to persuade people to take other animals seriously.
So if we're going to retreat away from rationality a little bit, although I guess, is it right to say that you think rationality does have a place?
Oh, I definitely think it does have a place. So I'm not arguing that we should just ditch reason, but rather that we should take seriously the fact that also emotions have a big role to play. And also I'm one of those people who believe that emotions and reason are entangled, so they constantly entwine and are something that impact each other. So if we want to be reasoned creatures, we also have to be, by definition, emotive creatures.
So what are emotions?
Well, my take on emotions is on par with a new school on emotive action. And the underlying idea is that emotions are not internal and essentialist. So we are not born with a given set of emotions which just stem from within and which are somehow neutral from the social setting in which we grow. But rather that emotions are concepts. So they are ways of conceptualizing reality. Emotions are thereby also socially constituted. So they take place in the cultural and political surrounding in which we live. And we often adopt them as children, and constantly also as we mature we keep refining them on the grounds of what our social setting dictates. But yeah, at the core is the notion that emotions are concepts. They're ways of making sense of the world. And in regards to animal ethics, emotions can be a way of making sense of the moral standing of other animals, and also what other animals are like, even their mindedness, their mentation, their descriptive characteristics are something that we partly make sense of on account of our emotive responses.
So, as you note, you give empathy a special place in your thinking and in your writing in this book. What is empathy?
Well, the primary argument in my book is that empathy is very multidimensional as a capacity. It takes many different forms, and those forms can be quite contradictory in regards to each other. So, for instance, I talk of cognitive empathy, which is empathy as perception. We perceive the mental states of another, or at least assume that we are perceiving them. And it's quite unaffective, so it doesn't have the affective dimension engaged with it. We can be thereby quite neutral on an affective level when it comes to cognitive emotion, and simply perceive the mental states and emotions of another creature. Thereby a hunter may be engaging in cognitive empathy when he or she is evaluating where the animal that she's hunting might move to and what the animal is going to do. And affective empathy, on the other hand, is resonation with the emotions of the other creature, and it's very much emotive, very much engaged with the affective realm. And that's just an example of how different the distinct varieties of empathy can be, and also how they can lead to completely different moral conclusions. So cognitive empathy is something we can use for manipulation and control. It can be quite amoral and immoral, whereas resonation and effective empathy is much more likely to evoke a moral response in us. If we resonate with the suffering of another, we are more likely to take her seriously into account as a morally relevant being.
So is there something that we can each be doing in order to harness or engage with what the right kind of empathy is, in your view?
In my book, I bring forward 6 different types of empathy, and I have to really highlight the fact that there really are whole variety of distinct forms of empathy. In social psychology alone, they speak of over 10 different varieties. So in my book, I deal with 6 of them. And my main argument in the end is that we should try and cultivate what I call reflective empathy. Reflective empathy takes into account the fact that empathy is partly impacted and influenced by our cultural settings, the social beliefs which we are constantly bombarded with. And it takes place on the first level order of mentation, which is the constant flow of our experiences and emotions and reasoned beliefs. And then it also takes place on the second order level of mentation, where we can reflect and analyze what's happening on the first order level. So that enables us to critically engage with the beliefs, the socially constituted beliefs that impact our empathy, for instance. So just to give you an example, empathy is notoriously biased and partial. We mostly empathize with those creatures who are similar to us or who are proximate to us, who we are used to, who live with us, for instance, and thereby we are more prone to feeling empathy towards cute cats and dogs whereas many people are less inclined to feel empathy towards fishes or farmed animals. And reflective empathy enables us to really critically engage with why does this happen? What makes us empathize more with given sorts of animals and leave the rest out? So it kind of pushes and sparks us to evaluate why and on what grounds we empathize with other animals, and particularly with what sorts of limitations we have in regards to our empathy abilities. Why don't we empathize more willingly with, say, chickens or pigs or cows or fishes? And these sorts of critical reflections, second-order reflections, might then enable us to extend the limits of our empathy further, so that we take into account all those creatures who do have a mind and who can experience their existence as something.
So for people who are animal advocates or interested in doing something positive for animals, what is your call in this book? Are you asking them to critically reflect on their emotional responses to animals or their empathetic responses to animals?
Yes, I'm doing that too. So I speak of anthropomorphism, for instance, in that book. I think it's a concept that's really problematic in everyday usage. I think that we speak on a cultural or social dimension far too much of anthropomorphism, and of course mostly other animals are mechanomorphized, so we tend to view them as mechanisms rather than as human-like creatures. But still, taking this into account, there is a danger of viewing other animals too much like they were human. So we might perceive too many human abilities or abilities specific to human beings in, for instance, dogs. And this leaves out their own animality, excludes their particular ways of being in this world. When it comes to farmed animals, the danger is that if they do not behave according to the norms we have when it comes to human ability, or even the sort of cuteness factor that we're looking for in animals, we don't take them seriously as the sorts of creatures that they are. Their own specific, distinct ways of animality are left outside of consideration. And so I'm trying to look for the sorts of empathic responses that enable us to respect the animals as they are, as their particular forms of beings, in their non-humanity as well as their similarities in comparison to us.
And so is it your hope that this approach will not only give food for thought to animal advocates or to, as perhaps, animal studies scholars, but will also be a way of engaging people who currently aren't interested in animal issues?
Well, I hope that I really do hope that it would persuade people to take a more empathic approach to pigs and cows and fishes and bears and lynxes and so forth. So I think that when we do animal studies, and particularly critical animal studies, the impetus should be taking other animals seriously into account. And my personal impetus is to raise the moral standing of other animals, and empathy is one way of persuading people to do that. So I'm hoping that by exploring the different types of empathy and by mapping out how we might empathize with other animals and what sorts of dangers are entwined with empathy as well, by doing that, hopefully I might also spark people to be more empathically responsive to animals. So yes, I have a very even a political agenda behind this.
And do you feel as though you're contributing to an emerging field of study or an emerging school of thought?
Yes. So for a long time, animal ethics was quite rationalistic, and it's understandable because for a long period of time, the idea was that taking animals into account was sentimental and thereby led by emotions and not something that we should consider philosophically as a serious enterprise. And so Singer, Regan, and many other theorists were very much trying to show that we can have reasoned arguments on behalf of taking other animals seriously into account. But then, for instance, ecofeminism started to go towards the ethics of care direction and tried to manifest how this emphasis on reason is entwined with a particular gender politics, and how we often take as the ideal the rational white Eurocentric man who is the kind of most popular manifestation of a reasoned animal. And the argument was that we should really also emphasize emotion, which had been marginalized because it had been viewed to be a particularly a female characteristic. So ethics of care and ecofeminism were the kind of starting point for taking emotions into account in animal philosophy. But still they remained slightly marginal, I think. And now there's a new trend happening, which is a type of effective animal ethics, which is considering moral psychology and particularly affects and emotions and experiences more generally as the foundation for how we morally view and perceive other animals. So I'm taking part in this project of effective animal ethics, and I hope to do that more in the future too by exploring other emotions such as shame and hate, anger, and particularly joy and attentiveness and attention.
Fascinating. Well, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, I am, Siobhan.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Oh, that would be, I'm being now so boring, but that would be Animal Liberation by Peter Singer.
That's quite okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Oh, gosh. What was my, so my first published article was, oh, God. Oh, it was on, yes, so I was offering a critique of continental approaches to animal philosophy, and I kind of regret doing that. But it was, so I was a young, very pro-analytic philosopher, and I tried to manifest how we should stay on the analytic side of things. And so I agree with some of the arguments that I was giving, but I'm very much kind of more continental these days, so I don't necessarily agree with the whole article anymore. But yeah, that was it. I think it was called God, I can't remember what it was called.
That's okay. Your biggest fans will be able to dig it up out of the archives.
I hope so. It was published in 2002. That's what I remember.
2002.
Yeah.
Well, it's lovely to know that you've been on a journey and that you're continuing to develop as a thinker and not kind of just, repeating the same thing over and over again. That's very refreshing.
Yeah, and I guess it shows that I'm not a very narcissistic person because I can't remember at all what I've done. Or maybe I just have amnesia. I don't know what's happening.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
One animal studies scholar. Oh, that's really difficult. Who's had a big impact? The biggest impacts that I have are outside of animal scholarship and animal studies. But within animal studies, the person who's most... gosh, this is really hard. I'm going to be really boring again. And can I have 2 names? Is that okay?
Most people refuse to adhere to the question and give me 2 to 3 names.
Okay, so I'm first going to say Tom Regan because I really appreciated his very precise and thorough manner. So as a young student, I was taken back and really, really impressed by his style of writing, because back then I felt that the topic had not been adequately addressed, and his way of writing in the case for animal rights was something that I have high regard for. But then philosophically, that's not necessarily the direction that I have gone towards. So philosophically, perhaps writers such as Corey Diamond have been more have had a more influential kind of impact sway on me. Yeah, I'm struggling for words. I wish we could do this interview finished.
If only. It would be a very big learning curve for me if we were able to.
So Corey Diamond is a writer who manages to write in a way that kind of makes you think. So I don't agree with all that she says, and I actually disagree with a lot, but the style of writing is such that it really does push you towards new directions. So that's why I would then say and nominate her as the second most influential thinker for me.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
The most important thing is for us to persuade people to take them seriously. I think animals are still very much in the margins of particularly Western existence, and we don't take their minds and their capacities, their cognitive abilities, their needs, their interests seriously into account, and we kind of ignore their existence as well as subjects. So as academics, we should bring them forward as these creatures who deserve our full attention. And of course, I take part in critical animal studies, so I also wish for the world to one day use animals far less and hopefully become vegan. But before that, I think just taking animals seriously into account would be the first and really primary step.
Well, I'll be interested to hear the response to the next question. There might be a bit of overlap, but that's okay. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would throw away the dualistic stance on other animals and really kind of view critically also species boundaries. I think that we are far too stuck with these rigid notions of species and species differences and the generic tendencies behind that way of thinking. So I wish that we didn't perceive other creatures in generic terms and try and categorize them constantly into these faceless classes that don't have their own specificities and which lack the effective realms and which lack the focus on experiences of particular animal subjects. So yeah, I would ditch generic dualistic categories.
Wonderful. So Elisa, what are you working on next?
I'm working on first of all on a book which has to do with ineffable ways of understanding other animals. So it's kind of engaged with the philosophy of language, but in a critical way. So I'm trying to map out how we might steer away from the primacy of propositional language that often dictates Western thought, and how we might understand other animals in more ineffable terms. And I'm writing that book with the Dutch philosopher Eva Meyer. We've been on this project for a long time, and hopefully we can conclude it in the near future. Most of the text has been written, but we just need to edit it. And the other thing is that I'm working on different emotions right now. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm looking into negative emotions such as shame and anger and fear, but mostly on joy, love and attentiveness as experiential ways of rethinking our moral agency in animal philosophy.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to seeing the fruits of both those projects, and hopefully you can come back on the show in the future. So how can people find out more about your work?
Well, they can look me online. I'm really, really bad at promoting my stuff on social media, but I did recently start an English blog. I have kept a Finnish blog for a long time, and and I've tried to talk of animal issues on a more popular level via that blog, and the main motive is to have some impact on how things are changing and try and make the world a better place for the animals. So now I'm trying to do that in English too, but there's only one blog there thus far. I'm hoping to write more in the future, and that's on philosophyhounds.com.
Fantastic. Well, check that out, philosophyhounds.com. So thank you so much for coming on the program, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, we're not shy about social media here at Knowing Animals, so follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals, and don't forget to tell other people about the show, review it on iTunes, and also subscribe on iTunes. iTunes is all powerful, and doing those things will help the program. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.